11th Street to the merge. It's 26 minutes from I-80 to the Ryan. Bishop Ford, 23 minutes from 8094 to the merge. And the Ryan is running 25 minutes from 95th to downtown. The Aiden's 21 minutes like Cook Junction, outbound 19. Kennedy, 38 minutes, so O'Hare to downtown, a tad quicker than the Express. Outbound 32 minutes downtown to the airport. Inbound Eisenhower, 40 minutes, 390 to downtown. Outbound 33. Inbound Stevenson is running 43 minutes, 355 to Lakeshore Drive. Northbound Tri-State, a little bit tight from the Reagan Tollway to the Eisenhower. Northbound Veterans Memorial, heavy 63rd to Maple. That's traffic. I'm Jim Calamonte on AM 560, The Answer.
Chicago's Morning Answer continues next in our 1-hour heating and air conditioning weather center. Our meteorologist, Steve Williams.
Couple of flurries around this morning, maybe some freezing drizzle too. Otherwise, a cloudy day, high 34. Clouds and flurries tonight, low 27. Clouds tomorrow and Thursday, high tomorrow 34. Thursday's high 35. I'm Steve Williams on AM 560, The Answer.
31 at O'Hare. Next news, 7:30. Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
This hourly segment is brought to you by Real Estate Revealed with Randy Barcella, Sunday mornings starting at 8.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. Well, that audio-video recording from over the weekend from Lev Parnas that was released and amplified by D.C. press corps outlets. All the emphasis, of course, was on Trump saying, this is from April of 18, get rid of that Marie Yovanovitch, get rid of that ambassador. And that was then subsequently brushed aside when the Bolton manuscript New York Times story came out. But interesting, if you go through more of that hour-long recording of Parnas's participation in a dinner with Trump back
April of 2018.
Yeah, almost 2 years ago now. There were other topics, a lot of other topics covered than just Ukraine, because Lev Parnas, being the oleaginous operator that he is, was...
He's just trying so hard to fit in and to be, prevalent in Trump's administration.
Well,
he's a groupie. He's exactly what Trump said he was.
He was looking for business opportunities and to leverage a relationship with the president is what he was doing, and trying to feel out where the president might be on particular policy issues that he could seize upon from a business perspective, monetize his information. And so the topic turned to marijuana legalization, brought up by Lev Parnas.
I think it's a tremendous movement with a lot of the young.
Do you think the whole marijuana thing is a good thing?
I think it's a combination. I think it's something that is in the future, and no matter how you look at it, I think it's something that's already so far out that you're not going to stop it. I think you need to be ahead of it, and I think you need to control it and regulate it.
In Colorado, they have more accidents. It does cause an IQ problem.
No, there is minus.
I think he's right.
No, there is minus.
You lose IQ points.
Yep.
But then you take a look at your opioid crisis and then the veterans and the
But
children.
it's actually good for opioids.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's fight against, yeah.
I'll say this.
Yeah.
Between that and alcohol, as far as I'm concerned, alcohol does much more damage.
Much more damage.
So, you don't see people driving, even
100%.
you don't see people beating their wives.
Well, this is
marijuana. It's just different.
This is what I want to recommend. What I want to recommend to you is not to move one way or the other, but what I want to recommend is to set up a committee.
So now,
a bipartisan committee, no politicians, but just leading people in the industry, so you could have your ear and so you could know what's going on to make the right decision. By just putting the committee.
The main reason I played that clip is so that you understand that some of the dumbest conversations on policies like this happen in the highest levels. That is about as stupid a conversation as you're going to hear on the topic of marijuana legalization. It was, 12 to 15 knuckleheads, including Lev Parnas, that were having dinner with the President of the United States, for goodness sake.
And they had 3 different conversations going on at the same time.
And none of them were a conversation I would have wanted to be a part of. For more on the topic, we're pleased to be joined by Alex Berenson, former New York Times reporter and author of the book Tell Your Children, The Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence. Alex, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Dan and Amy, thanks so much for having me.
There was something the president said, though, in terms of his reticence to embrace the notion of marijuana legalization generally, even though it's not really so much an issue federally at this point. About IQ points, which is sort of a throwaway line, too. But it goes to the more substantive discussion about how heavy marijuana use impacts your mental faculties, and that's where I wanted to start.
Yes, I mean, and I actually think it's a very interesting conversation. I read it yesterday, but I hadn't heard it until today. The president actually, his instincts are quite correct. There is evidence, although it's not particularly strong evidence. It comes from a study in New Zealand that cannabis use does actually lower IQ if you use it for a prolonged period of time. And I think I wouldn't say that's proven by any means, but his instinct on that cannabis can be psychiatrically dangerous to your mental health is totally correct. Mm-hmm. And it's so interesting to hear the arguments that Lev is making and that Donald Trump Jr. are making, because they're the same lies that the cannabis community, or perhaps I should say propaganda, that the cannabis community has so successfully spread for so long. That cannabis is going to somehow help the opioid crisis, that cannabis doesn't cause, or it's not associated with violence in the way that alcohol is. And I actually think that they probably believe what they're saying. They just have no idea what the facts and the data and the science actually say. And the president, his instincts are right about this.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with that. But some of the other things that were bandied about, like you say, yes. People don't get high and beat their wives like they do when they have 6 Budweisers or something like this. I mean, it's sort of
or a flask of whiskey.
Where to begin with the stupidity, but speak to that, because we had this conversation last week about Delonte West, this former Cleveland Cavs and Boston Celtics standout NBA player, made $16 million during his NBA career. He's been homeless or marginally sheltered for the last 4 years. He seems to be struggling with mental illness. His former teammate said he'd been diagnosed bipolar more than a decade ago, and it's really a tragic story. But he was also one of these individuals in the NBA who was celebrated and did celebrating his own self heavy marijuana usage. And you wonder if that, and I don't know, but you wonder if this is an example of heavy marijuana usage bringing on an extended psychosis that has left Delonte West where he is now.
So I think it's a very good question, and obviously it's very hard to comment on any individual case. But it is clear that cannabis use can cause psychosis, and it certainly can cause temporary psychosis. That's already happening in Illinois. I know that various media outlets have already reported that since legalization, some hospitals have seen an uptick in presentations of psychosis in their emergency rooms. And just for your listeners who may not know what the technical meaning of psychosis is, it's what psychiatrists use to describe somebody who's having hallucinations or delusions, or can't form coherent sentences, whose mind has broken down. And that's often caused by drug use. Temporary psychosis is often caused by drug use. And if it gets really bad and you start to get paranoid, you start to hallucinate that people are after you, that's when the police get called. That's when you wind up in an emergency room. So that's, it's a really devastating condition when it becomes permanent. That's what psychiatrists usually call schizophrenia. There are other versions of it, but that really wrecks people's lives. And there's evidence, pretty strong evidence, that cannabis use, especially heavy use, and especially if you start as a teenager, can actually increase substantially your odds of getting schizophrenia. But and the cannabis community, what I call Psychosis Inc., hates to talk about this. They cannot stand talking about it.
Well, technically, you're supposed to be 21 years old to buy it legally in the state of Illinois, but we all know that people are using in their early teens. But what do you tell your children? I have 2 boys who, I'm not going to say, but I have 2 boys who, sure. It's out there. It's all over every school. I don't care if it's a selective enrollment school or New Trier or Stevenson. It's there. It's in it's in vaping. THC is everywhere, and now there's edibles out there that kids are using.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I called the book Tell Your Children because I did know that, obviously this is happening in reality, whatever the laws say. And so parents have to be able to talk to their kids about this. I'd say three really important things. One, look, if you want to use cannabis, try not to use it in your teens. Wait until you're in your 20s when your mind is more developed. The statistics seem pretty clear that using later is safer. Two, don't think this is a safe substitute for alcohol, and don't get in a car with somebody who's high. There's this notion that drivers who are high drive very slowly and very cautiously, and that is also not true. Actually, in states that have legalized like Colorado and Washington, driving deaths are way up, and driving deaths where the person was only using THC, which is the active, a chemical in cannabis, and no other drugs in their system, those deaths are way up. And then three, understand that this is way stronger than it used to be. So you might have used, if your kid says to you, well, you smoked pot once or, a few times when you were in college or in your 20s, it doesn't seem to have hurt you. You can say, look, this is a very different product. This is the difference is the difference between the equivalent of having a beer or two and drinking a whole fifth of whiskey. And that's true. It is much stronger. The THC content is much higher. So it's not the same drug. So you can tell your children things that are true, that are not just scare tactics, and that hopefully they'll listen to a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a key point of this too, because a lot of the pushback I get when we have you on, or when I repurpose some of your work or other studies on the topic, you get what about alcohol? What about cigarettes? So on and so forth, and you're just sort of moralizing. It's just and your just instinct is prohibition. No, it's not that. It's just. This is not something to be celebrated. And I understand what the cannabis industry is going to do, just like what the booze industry does, just like what cigarette makers did. They're going to market using the Marlboro Man. They're going to market with kitschy sports commercials for beer. And cannabis is going to market and say this is cool, too. I get that. The difference is, as a civic leader or from the political class or from like responsible media outlets, it's to not just get in line to be a cheerleader. It's to say, let's just understand what this is and what the implications are and what some of the dangers are depending on usage level. And so just like you get an understanding that there are consequences that potentially you don't want to experience that you might want to consider before you run headlong into the cheerleading section.
That's exactly right, Dan. And sometimes people say to me, well, you're not an MD. You're not a PhD. What's your authority to talk about this? And I say to them, that's true, but the science is very clear. And what I used to be for a long time, was an investigative reporter. And I view what's happened with cannabis in our country as a failure of reporting. It's a failure of the media class to push back on the propaganda that's being spread by the cannabis industry. Because you're absolutely right. Alcohol is not safe. Cigarettes are not safe. Opioids are certainly not safe. But we have people, when the companies try to promote this, pushing back. And we've learned that, you can't trust cigarette companies. You can't trust the opioid pharmaceutical companies. Yet somehow with cannabis, the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, the Washington Post, these places they lap up the propaganda. And I truly don't understand why. I mean, I know that there are reasons. It's a cultural issue. It's been sold as a racial and social justice issue, but it just doesn't make sense.
Well, speaking of the science and research, another interesting study just out this week from some University of Texas researchers finds that in areas where recreational marijuana has been legalized, they find that is associated with a 4 to 7% increase in cigarette consumption. So, I mean, it's just, so cigarettes are bad, too. You don't want to do those. Of course, you have to do those because we're taxing them. I mean, we've already spent the money, and now it's the same thing with marijuana. But all this is bad for you. Please don't do it, but you have to do it because and now they're complementary, or at least there's one study that suggests there's complementary when it comes to usage. I mean, it's just that you can't have these conversations without saying, well, what about alcohol? Well, what about alcohol? Let's talk about alcohol, too. I mean, that what about alcohol argument is so silly.
Alcohol is not a safe drug, and taxes on it are probably too low. But we're never going to prohibit alcohol. We tried that, and people in Chicago certainly know it happened. But alcohol is way more a part of the fabric of the United States, and frankly of the whole world, than cannabis is. In the United States last year, about 2/3 of American adults had a drink, at least one drink. Only about 15 or 16% of adults use cannabis. And that number actually hasn't risen that much in the last 15 years, despite all the promotion. It seems like there's a lot of people who actually just don't like the feeling that cannabis gives them. Then there's some people who obviously really love that feeling. But cannabis, don't be fooled by this idea that everybody's doing it. Yes, a lot of people are doing it. Yes, the number has gone up, but it is not really a part of the social fabric the way alcohol is. And that's why we can still make reasonable decisions about whether we're going to allow the normalization and the commercialization of this drug.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And Anthony Esselin, the academic, makes this point too. Just because you can't prohibit everything doesn't mean you shouldn't prohibit anything. And the idea is exactly what you say, sort of woven into the social fabric. So, and maybe you don't want to prohibit marijuana either, but at least recognize what you're celebrating, what you're incentivizing, to use your word, what you're normalizing, as opposed to just making sort of these moral relativist arguments. Well, if we're going to be licentious in one area, let's be licentious in every area.
That's right. And I think, nobody, I mean, actually there are a few people on the left, but almost nobody would say we should legalize heroin and cocaine. And the reason is that those drugs are clearly extremely dangerous to the users, as well as to society. So that they cause, dramatic problems, even though fewer than 1% of Americans use them regularly. So the danger of the drug does matter, and knowing the dangers of the drug is important to have an honest conversation about legalization. And I think you're right. Like there are reasonable arguments that cannabis should be legalized, that too many people use it, it's gone too far. But let's be honest about what the dangers are, and then we can have a real conversation about legalization.
And why do you think the press is so pro-pot? I mean, we never get any of this information because, they're touting, another dispensary is, opened, or they ran out of weed here and now go to this location. It's very bizarre.
There's three reasons, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but I've concluded there's three reasons. One is they don't understand how weak the evidence around the medical uses are, so that's overestimated. Two is the cannabis lobbies, whether nonprofit or the for-profit industry, have sold this as a social justice issue. This is going to fix, our criminal justice system. There will, suddenly there'll be no disparities in arrests or anything, none of which is true. The criminal justice system will function in Illinois just as it has with legalization or without. And then the third thing, and this to me is the saddest one of all, is the people running these media outlets for the most part still are a bunch of middle-aged white guys, and they are desperate to feel culturally relevant and be cool. It's
true.
So sad.
I know, it's
true. And my secret weapon in this fight, I joke about it, is I don't care anymore whether anybody thinks I'm cool. Say what you want about me. I know what the facts are on this drug, and I'm going to do my best to spread them. But it is sad to, when middle-aged guys are like, yeah, I used a couple weeks ago and it was great. I had this fancy dinner on the Upper West Side of Manhattan and we all had a great time and we had edibles. Well, you know what? That's fantastic. I'm glad you had a nice time, but it doesn't change the fact that a lot of people who use this drug have really serious problems with it.
He is Alex Berenson, former New York Times reporter, not a dilettante, author of Tell Your Children the Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence. Alex, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Dan and Amy, thanks so much for having me.
Take care.
Yep, and he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's what Chicago is talking about. It's Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy on AM 560. The Answer.
So you have missing teeth, and you've thought about dental implants. There's a lot to consider: safety, quality, price, and more. Make a call today and get your question